I'm the founder of an organisation called the Sustainable Food Trust, whose mission is to work internationally to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food systems. A small organisation really working catalytically. And I'm also a farmer. I got back to the land in the 70s, and I've now had the privilege of trying to farm for over 42 years in a relatively sustainable manner, and witnessing the impact of my actions on the soil and the landscape of my farm over time. And some of the observations that I've derived from that experience include the fact that everything is connected, that you can't separate things, that everything is finite, and that everything is subject to change and evolution. I think also that we can understand the whole by understanding the small, the cellular, and all those insights have come from my farming experience. And I'm so happy that you have included food and sustainable food in your theme for this year, because it seems to me that is of historic significance. And to gain an understanding of the historic nature of this decision, I want to take a very brief look over the history of agriculture and food systems over the last century. The industrial period of food and farming really didn't get going until well into the 20th century, but the seeds were sown at the end of the 19th century with the invention through the Haber-Bosch process of nitrogen fertilizer and other technical innovations which enabled farmers to start to use technology to increase productivity. At that time, there was a British man at the height of the empire, knighted for his services to agricultural research, who was sent to India to teach the peasant farmers how to adopt these modern methods. His name was Sir Albert Howard. When he arrived there, he had the humility to realise that he had nothing to teach the peasant farmers that he called his professors, because they already understood truly sustainable methods of production. He spent 35 years in India studying their methods, and came back to England in 1940 and published a book called An Agricultural Testament, which was his homage to what he'd learned, which was that the health of soil, plants, animals and people are one and indivisible, and that we need to understand and apply these laws in future farming practices. His book was widely read, but it wasn't really influential, because at that time we were just coming into the Second World War, where there was a period of great food insecurity, and ironically, after the war, the capacity to use nitrogen fertilizer greatly expanded because, of course, it was a product used in the explosives industry. So after the war, the combination of food insecurity and the 6-year history of food insecurity in the UK, but also all over the world, and the availability of new technologies, constantly evolving technologies, and cheap nitrogen fertilizer was seized upon by governments. And in the UK, it was the 1947 Agricultural Act, but in the EU, of course, the Common Agricultural Policy, again with a food security element, subsidised every tonne of grain, litre of milk, and the chapter of intensification continued. There were other voices that tried to stand up against this, but they were really ignored, and as a result, the intensification went on. And in parallel with this, in 1962, Rachel Carson published a book, Silent Spring, which was to have an enormous effect on environmental thinking. What she said essentially was that agriculture is destroying nature, particularly focusing on pesticides at the time. And as a result, she really mobilized a huge new global impulse, which expressed itself in the development of many conservation organizations all over the world, whose mission was to protect nature against agriculture, not realizing, to quote the words of E.F. Schumacher, that if we win the battle with nature, we will end up on the losing side. So really, the nature conservation movement, which was funded by philanthropic organizations all over the world, and continues to be, was based on this idea of separation of nature from food production. And that has had profound consequences, I think, in people's attitude towards food. Many people don't realise that food production could be part of nature, but it isn't so anymore. And then a third strand, the development movement. Based really, I would say, on exporting our industrial model to fast-forward development in Africa and other parts of the world which are emerging into developed economies. I would say, again, based on the premise that the best way forward would be to give peasant farmers access to hybrid seeds and to fertilizers, so that they could sell commodity crops onto global markets and then get to our standard of living. Now, in parallel with that, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think that you can understand the big by understanding the small. I was busy on my farm, part of a hippie commune originally, which fell apart quite quickly, but gave rise to an ongoing experiment in the application of sustainable philosophy. And we realised pretty quickly, because of the common agricultural policy, that we couldn't compete against our neighbours who were benefiting from fertilisers. So we thought, well, why don't we write down the prescription for sustainable agriculture and take our products to the market? And that was part of the development of the organic market. And I subsequently worked for the Soil Association, which is the leading UK body in the UK, promoting organic farming for many years. I actually drafted the organic dairy standards because my farm's an organic dairy farm and we make cheese. We were trying to practice the principle of the law of return, of nutrients, of growing the cattle feed on our farm, and minimising our reliance on outside non-renewable resources. So we took this story to the market, and the organic market thrived and prospered, but, and this is my recent realisation, we created a ghetto of our own making. Because if you look at the scale and extent of the organic market globally now, it varies between countries, of course, but I think you could say that 5% would be fairly optimistic. We've reached a glass ceiling that we haven't broken through yet. And it's certainly come to me that if we get to change, if we get to respond to the growing environmental crisis, it's not just a niche market we need to create, we need to change the whole of agriculture. Now, I believe that there's a parallel realization going on in the environmental movement, in the development organizations, and in philanthropy, and this is incredibly exciting. So there is a realization that this chapter of industrial agriculture, which promised so much at the beginning of or the middle of the 21st century, is failing because it's destroying natural capital. It's a mining operation. We're depleting nature's capital and we're forcefully accounting for it in our balance sheet because we're ignoring it. It's indivisible. And we need to change the way in which we assess the impact of our farming systems on the soil in particular. Of course, in this year, 2015, the International Year of Soil. And the environmental organizations have realized that their conservation, nature park approach is failing to arrest the decline in biodiversity. And the development organizations too are realizing that this industrial model is not appropriate for the millions of smallholder farmers who still produce so much of the world's food. So I think that there is a transition going on already, an amazing transition. The environmental organisations are getting this stuff. I mean, in the UK, the RSPB is an example of that. Its executive director is on the new road. He's starting to think in a new way. And I think the same is true in development organisations. There's a road to go down. I don't think all of them are fully cognizant of this idea of holistic thinking, more systemic thinking in development, but I think it's starting to happen. And in the food and farming sector, I've just been for the last 2 days at a conference organised by the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, which was really catalysed by the Prince of Wales holding a meeting in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. in 2011 of philanthropists, which led to 2 other meetings, and then the emergence of this new global collaboration of farmers with an interest in moving and supporting more sustainable production, and philanthropic organisations who might have been hitherto involved with, probably still are, development and environment and everything else, including climate change, and realising actually that if we want to tackle those issues, a central part of sorting them out is in fact attending to food, to building more sustainable food and farming systems. I've got a couple more minutes. I want to just give a couple of examples in conclusion of the kind of thinking that I think needs to prevail if we are to achieve this transition. The first is drawn from a newly emerging understanding of the human biome and the reality that there are between 3 and 10 times as many organisms in our bodies as there are cells, and that they have an extraordinary dynamic interaction with us in maintaining our health. And I believe that this is a metaphor for a new understanding of the need to move from chemistry to biology in agriculture. And this has profoundly affected me in relation to my own farm, because I've come to understand that the soil is like the stomach of the plant. Plants don't actually have an internal stomach, they have an exogenous stomach, which is in the root zone. They have an extraordinary relationship with bacteria and fungi, which coexist with them in the root zone. They actually feed them. And the bacteria and fungi play a central role in breaking down the soil organic matter through which the plants nourish themselves. And in coming to this understanding through firstly relating to this idea of the human biome through my own body, and then applying the thinking to my farm, I've realised that I'm actually at the beginning, even after 40 years, of a new chapter of engagement with my own soil, because I think this kind of systemic thinking has huge implications and application globally. And this leads to another issue of observation I've come to very recently, which is that the dependency on nitrogen fertilizer, the drug of choice used in agriculture for more than 50 years now, which has led to a great decline in soil biology, has also led to the end of mixed farming, by which I mean fertility building through crop rotation, usually using animals to digest the cellulose, which cannot be digested by us, normally ruminant animals, and those ruminant animals playing a vital part in rebuilding soil fertility. But if you look around the world now, especially in the more developed countries, there's very little mixed farming. It's either arable or it's livestock. And I think this has to change, because if we are going to rebuild the depleted soil carbon, which has resulted from 50 years of industrial agriculture, we will need to go back or forward to mixed farming, and ruminants will play a role in that. I know that's quite controversial. Now, if you ask a farmer, as I do, whether an arable farm, where they can do this, they're going to say, of course we can't, because there's no business case for it. If you try to farm in a mixed way, as I do, you'll need a day job, which luckily I have, to subsidise the losses. But the reason why you can't make a business case for farming properly, in my view, is because of the absence of true cost accounting. In other words, the absence of honest accounting, where you take account of the balance sheet and the P&L account of the impact of your practices on natural capital, on pollution, on animal welfare, on the social impact, and critically on public health. So I'm involved with others in a project which is trying to get a handle on this. Now, all that sounds quite difficult, but I believe that we're quite close to a tipping point where the combination of, particularly the millennials, who I think understand a lot of this stuff intuitively and are mobilising from the ground up, possibly beneath the radar screen of governments and maybe some other big organisations, to try to build the future or co-create the future together that we need to imagine, because there's no route map yet. And even though you could argue that some of what I've said stands at the very limits of our physical, technical, social, and economic capacity, it's going to happen, because it has the decisive advantage that there is no alternative.